ocean, I'm the guy they call, or somebody like me. So I got my start flying from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Um, Started flying back in the early 80s. Got my start in aviation. I was in the Minnesota National Guard as a Huey crew chief. And at one of our drill meetings, talking to a fellow crew chief, and he mentioned that he just got back from Africa. And I said, "Well, God, that sounds. What the heck were you doing in Africa?" It's delivering a plane. Tell me more. And he explained ferry pilot, that he was a ferry pilot delivering small airplanes around the world, usually planes that have been sold. If a plane is in Kansas and it was sold to a guy in South Africa, he's the one that flies it there. And when I heard that, I said, man, that sounds like the job for me. So I made it my goal to become a ferry pilot. Only had one small problem at that point is I didn't have a pilot's license at the time, but I didn't let that stop me. Went and got my pilot's license, built up time flying skydivers in old beat up 182s, which was perfect training for ferry flying because when you're ferry flying, you run into a lot of planes that are pretty beat up. So when I finally had enough hours, I had 1,000 hours. I've been flying for 3 years at that point. So you got 1,000 hours, you obviously know absolutely everything there is to know about aviation. So I went and got hired by Orient Air, which is a ferry company out of St. Paul, Minnesota. And they hired me to ferry a Beach Duchess, which is a light twin, ferry it from St. Paul, Minnesota to Lisbon, Portugal. So that was going to be my first trip. No little messing around, nothing like that. It's like right off over the ocean. So I'd be flying alone on that very first trip. My boss, Pete Demas, he was going to be flying with me, but he'd be in a different airplane. So we'd be in the same airspace, but I was really going to be making that first transatlantic trip by myself. But, they decided they needed to have some training. So they did before we took off, ran me through Orient Air's extensive ferry pilot training program, which consisted of sitting in his office drinking scotch with him for 3 hours while he told me all the different ways you could get killed flying over the North Atlantic, which is like great, very inspiring. And then we took off. So our route on that first trip was St. Paul to Bangor, Maine, where we cleared customs. Then from there, we went to St. John's, Newfoundland, which is the easternmost point of North America, basically on that island off the east coast of Canada. And from there, we're going to be flying 1,500 miles to Santa Maria, the Azores. The Azores are a cluster of islands about 800 miles off the coast of Portugal. And that 1,500-mile leg in the Duchess was going to take about 10 hours. So that was going to be 10-hour leg over water. So that was a pretty big introduction to ferry flying. Sitting there and listening to my boss tell me all the different ways you could get killed. Most of them dealt with running into bad weather or running out of gas. So that whole first that taking off on that first trip was pretty nerve-wracking. And let me tell you, when you take off and head out over the ocean and you look back over your shoulder and you watch shoreline disappear and you realize that you're really doing it, that's pretty nerve-wracking and kind of terrifying in that first one. Because up until that point, I'd done absolutely nothing at all like that. The closest I'd been to that situation is flying over Lake Michigan, and there's a 5-minute window in there that you might not be able to coast to the shoreline if your engine quits. And when it's 1,500 miles, it's pretty daunting. But it was a beautiful day, and the engine ran great, and everything was fine, and all my worries faded away, and I just sat back and enjoyed the beautiful trip, uneventful to Santa Maria. Well, it was uneventful for half the trip. And then instead of me having the problem that I was dreading, it turned out my boss had the problem. He called me up and said he'd lost his vacuum pump. And he was a little nervous about that because the second half of the trip was hard IFR. The weather forecast for Santa Maria was low clouds, high winds, and heavy rain. And it was also going to be in the dark. And he was definitely not up on his no gyro needle ball airspeed IFR training. So he had the bright idea that he was going to circle. He was ahead of me by about 15 minutes. He circled in place and let me catch up with him, and we hooked up. And what he did for the rest of that night is he used me as his artificial horizon. We flew formation IFR all the way to Santa Maria, which was pretty terrifying because no, we hadn't practiced that. And no, his formation skills were not great. I kept looking over my shoulder, seeing that red and green position lights weaving and bobbing all over the sky. And I was just praying that he wasn't going to hit me. But we managed to get down and survive that first trip. And that was my introduction to ferry flying. And it turned out to be a pretty common theme throughout my career as a ferry pilot, because let me tell you, just about every single time you fly an airplane halfway around the world, something's going to happen. It's just pretty much guaranteed. So what most people ask me when I'm ferry flying is how do you get these planes over the ocean? I mean, a 182 is definitely not designed to fly 1,500 miles or 2,000 miles over the ocean. So what do you do to get them there? And the biggest obstacle you have to fix is obviously fuel. So what we do is we put ferry tanks in the planes, big metal tanks. You can use rubber, but I prefer the metal tanks inside the plane, and you plumb it right into the fuel system, or sometimes right into the wing tanks. And that's how you get enough fuel to give you the range to get across the ocean. Now, when we use ferry tanks, the FAA allows us 25 to 30% over max gross weight. So the planes are really heavy. And they used to allow us 2 inches of ASCG, but too many guys got killed doing that. So they've taken that away from us. So we've got to keep it within weight and balance parameters, which means that the ferry tanks are smashed up as far forward as possible to keep your CG within limits, which makes it pretty uncomfortable flying, because that means the seats have to be really far forward. The other thing that we do for the planes to get them ready to fly over the ocean is we install an HF radio. It stands for high frequency. It's a long range radio, kind of like a ham radio, that allows us to talk to shore when you're 1,000 miles out over the ocean. So otherwise you wouldn't be able to give your position reports or holler for help if something happened. After that, pretty much fill the plane with a couple of bags of snacks and 180 pounds of stupid pilot, and you're ready to go fly across the ocean. So we have some unique challenges as a ferry pilot. Number one is we almost never get checked out in the planes we fly, because most of these planes that we're ferrying are planes that are being sold. We don't reposition much. Usually it's delivering a plane to a new buyer. And that means if the plane's already sold, that means the seller doesn't want to have anything to do with the plane, because only bad stuff can happen if we go flying in it. So he doesn't want to fly it and wreck it. So pretty much just tosses you the keys and say, there you go, Mr. Professional Ferry Pilot, go fly my airplane. Which can be challenging in planes that you've not only never flown before, but sometimes I've never even heard of these kinds of planes before. So basically I'll show up to an airport, they toss me the keys, and first thing I do is dig out the pilot's operating handbook and start reading, jot down a few pertinent V speeds, any unusual emergency procedures, fuel management, stuff like that. Then turn to the page marked how to start the engine, get her started, and take off and figure out the rest en route. And I tell you, I actually like that. I love being able to just hop in any old airplane and fly it, because for the most part, an airplane's an airplane. Keep your speed up. Don't stall. Don't torch the engine. You'll probably be okay. Other problems that we have as a ferry pilot is, weather en route. You're going to have lots of weather problems, and usually the forecasts you get are pretty outdated, because especially when I started back in the 90s, we didn't have ForeFlight, we didn't have internet, we didn't have cell phones. It was calling up for a weather forecast or getting a paper forecast that by the time you got it was maybe 3 or 4 hours old. And then you add in a couple hours to get ready to go, 8 to 10 to 14-hour flight. So by the time you got to your destination, that forecast could be 15 to 20 hours old. So you really had no idea what you were going to run into when you got to your destination. So you pretty much have to deal with what you get. Other problems that we deal with as a ferry pilot is language barriers. In flight, it's not usually a big deal because everybody's supposed to speak English, although sometimes foreign controllers' accents can be tough to deal with. But on the ground, definitely that's not the case. And having to navigate the bureaucracy of foreign airports can be quite challenging because you got to get fuel, pay your landing fees, get hotels, any maintenance you're going to do, all that stuff. And if you don't speak the language, it can be challenging. It's easier now with the internet because even if they don't speak English, sometimes there's translation stuff you can use on your phone. But back in the '90s, it was challenging. Then the other challenge that you get is navigation. That's kind of the big one besides fuel management. You got to be able to find Europe or find the Azores. Now, when I started, it was back in the early '90s. I did my first trip in 1990. We didn't have that neat little invention called GPS. So my first 8 trips over the Atlantic Ocean were exactly like Charles Lindbergh did, with nothing but a compass, and that's pretty intimidating. Luckily, we got good winds law forecasts from Nav Canada, so we'd sit down and get out your E6, trusty old E6B, and do a flight plan for the entire Atlantic, and every different lat long position, your heading's going to change just a little bit. And once you take off over the ocean, you pretty much just have to trust your flight plan. You really have no way to check your progress. And that means if you run into major headwinds or crosswinds that would throw you off course or possibly prevent you from reaching your destination before you run out of gas, you really have no way of knowing that until you're already really in trouble. Now, luckily, the Canadians do a great job of giving a winds law forecast, and I never had significant problems before GPS. But I do know some guys that had some major problems, and I knew some guys that did not make it. So definitely, when GPS came on board, that was a real game changer. And the other main thing that makes international ferry flying so much different than other flying is when you're out over the ocean, you're going to have to deal with what you get, especially once you cross the point of no return. The point of no return is basically, we call it the equal time point as well. Basically, it's a line that once you cross that, it'll take you just as long to continue on to your destination as it is to go back. At any point past that line, you cannot turn around and go back. You are committed to going on. So at that point, whatever happens after that point, you have to deal with. There's no choice. I mean, if you get a maintenance issue, navigation issue, weather problem, doesn't matter. I mean, it's so much different than flying in the United States, where there's literally an airport every 15 to 20 miles, and when you're over the U.S., there's almost never a point where you're beyond gliding distance to at least some safe flat point of ground. But when you're out over the ocean, even 50 miles out, if your engine kills there, you're going swimming. So the other problems that we have are, fatigue. When you're ferrying a plane from St. Paul to Singapore, that's a long trip, and long days for long flight days. So you're really battling fatigue a lot, especially when you're flying. And one of the problems when you're going east is you're burning through time zones. So a typical day is you're getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, trying to get out to the airport and off the ground before the sun comes up. Fly 8, 10, 15 hours. Get to get to your destination. By the time you get there, it's late at night. It's too late to get any food. Get the airplane fueled up, pay your fees, check their customs and stuff. Get to the hotel, try to get some sleep to do it again the next day. After 3-4 days of that, you're pretty beat. Now the worst is usually mid-morning when the sun comes up and it's beating on, come through the windshield, and you're getting hot in the cockpit, and the drone of the engine really wants to put you to sleep. So that can be one of the biggest challenges of ferry flying. I did a lot of listen to a lot of music, sing along with the music, drum on the dashboard, play a lot of air guitar. I got really good at air guitar. It's got to do something to keep yourself up. Read a lot of books, stuff like that. I also drank a lot of diet sodas. You know, got to keep that caffeine going. Although, of course, you know, you learn from science class that when you drink a lot of liquids, eventually you're going to have to deal with the result. And that can be uncomfortable on a 15-hour leg. When I first started, my boss told me to always bring a plastic jug along to pee in along the way so you're not uncomfortable the whole time. I never cared for that method because I hated going into an airport, you know, some brand new airport in a foreign country, carrying my flight bag and a bottle of something that's obviously not apple juice. So what I did is I developed the Ziploc baggie method. Pee into a Ziploc baggie, and you can seal it up nice and clean. Always use 2 baggies. You're gonna have to trust me on that one. And you know, if you're in an airplane that has an in-flight window that you get rid of it, you just open the window and chuck it right up. You're all done. No muss, no fuss. Of course, when I'm flying over the ocean, I would usually save the pee bags for targets of opportunity. Any ships down there, you know, see if you can hit them. I don't think I ever hit anybody, but if I did, I'm really, really sorry. I don't do that anymore. The other question that people ask me a lot is it dangerous? And the answer is, you bet. It is very dangerous. Back when I started in the 90s, on average of 3 pilots got killed every year flying the North Atlantic. That was not from our company. That was all the ferry flying combined. Guys would run into maintenance issues and weather issues, or sometimes you just have no idea. He just didn't show up. So one of my main goals when I'm ferry flying is safety, because my company, Orient Air, in the whole time it existed, it lost 3 pilots, and I got my job from a guy who didn't make it. So I take my safety real seriously. So what we do to try to increase your odds of surviving a problem is, number one, we wear survival suits, which are quarter-inch neoprene Gumby suits, seals up everything except just a face hole. They're lifesavers in the water, but very uncomfortable in the plane because you have to wear them. You can't have it in a bag, because if something were to happen, you wouldn't have time to get it on. They're very difficult to get on, especially if it's a single engine. So you get pretty hot and sweaty, you know, flying like that. Usually I have it down around my waist for most of the flight, but you got at least have to have your legs in it. And we also carry rafts along, because it doesn't do you any good to get out of the plane just in your survival suit and be floating in the North Atlantic, basically in a life jacket. You're not going to survive that. You have to have a life raft. I usually carry a 6-man life raft. You want something that's a little bit bigger, and it definitely has to have a cover. Can't North Atlantic, you won't survive if you're in an open life raft. So you got to remember, you're going to be in the water a long time, because once you're more than 100 miles offshore, the only way anybody's going to come and get you is by boat, because helicopters don't have a range going more than 100 miles, and there's no seaplanes left anymore. So the only thing that they can send for you is a boat, and boats are slow. A brand new Platus PC-12 just went down about a month ago, halfway between California and Hawaii. They had a ferry tank problem, and they had to ditch, and they were in the raft 22 hours, and they were lucky they were shipped right close to them. You could definitely plan on spending at least 2 days in your raft before anybody's going to get to you. Other stuff I bring with me when I'm for survival is I always carry an EPIRB, emergency locator beacon. Back before those were invented, I carried an actual airplane ELT, which I never really had much confidence in. But now with the EPIRB, I think they probably work pretty good. So I'm pretty confident that they'll at least know where to find my body. Other things is a signaling device. I used to, back in the 90s, I carried flares, aircraft, you know, parachute flares, but you can't use that anymore because you can't get them home on the airlines. So now I carry laser pointers. Work pretty good, actually. You don't want to shine at the pilot's eyes too much, but they're pretty good, and you can carry extra batteries. I also carry some water, a little bit of food. I don't bother with any any fishing gear or something, I'm not going to starve to death out there. Definitely die of exposure and thirst long before you starve to death these days. And most of the stuff that I really want to carry, I carry with me zipped inside my survival suit, because one of the biggest problems with ditching is getting out of the plane, especially if you're in a fixed gear plane. Ditching is the thing that we train for, but you really can't prepare yourself for, because it's going to be a violent impact with the water, and the plane's immediately going to go upside down and start sinking. And one of the biggest problems I have is when you have the ferry tanks in there, like I mentioned, the seats are pushed as far forward as they can be. So it's hard to get out of those planes when it's sitting on the ramp. Upside down at night, sinking in 20-foot swells, you're going to have a hard time getting out with just your raft. Having a big bag of lots of extra stuff is just not realistic. So I have a bag. I call it my dessert bag. If I can get out of the plane with that stuff, with all that's extra survival are great, but I'm not counting on it. Everything I really want is zipped into my bag, into my survival suit. But it's not all it's not all danger and hardship and near death experiences. You know, a lot of the stuff that you're going to get when you're ferry flying is amazing stuff. You know, the stuff that I really like about ferry flying is the adventure of it all. I love the fact that somebody will toss me their keys and say, "Here, go fly my plane halfway around the world." It's what I became a pilot for. It's amazing, and that's the best way to see the world, because I try to avoid the big airports. You land at small airports like your guys' airport, and what are at small airports? Degenerate pilots like you guys, you know, hangar pilots. You land someplace and you start talking to these guys and become great friends. They take you out, take you to dinner, give you a place to stay, try to get you to marry their daughter, stuff like that. You know, it's a lot of fun. I love the aviation community, and it's the same community all over the world. The same kind of guys. I mean, they want to hear about how you got this plane from the United States to Turkey or Tanzania or whatever. You know, it's just it's great. But you do run into the problems. I lost an engine in a Mooney one time at 19,000 feet while penetrating a line of thunderstorms. That was exciting. I had to dead stick in the middle of a thunderstorm, try to find an airport to land at. That was a ferry tank problem. I lost an alternator in a 210 one night over the Sahara. I took off from Agadir, Morocco, flying all the way down the bulge of Africa to Abidjan, the Ivory Coast. You fly that road at night. You fly the Sahara at night, so you arrive down by the equator in the morning. That way you avoid the afternoon thunderstorms. And I'd gotten chased out of Morocco by a sandstorm. So right after I took off, they closed the airport. No big deal. That was a 14-hour leg. And about 3 hours into it, I had an RBL come on. Oh, and RBL is a really bad light. It's the big red lights on the dash that you don't want to see. Alternator is what this one said. And I saw that, yep, my ammeter was showing a draw. So, yep, lost the alternator. Great. Fall back to your training. Turn everything off. Autopilot. That's a bummer. It's giving me a long night of hand flying. Turn all the lights down. Turn all the radios off. Then I made my big mistake that evening. I grabbed my HF radio mic and I was going to make a call to ATC to tell them they weren't going to hear from me the rest of the night. And when I keyed the mic, everything in the cockpit went dark. And that was a big mistake, because the HF radios use a ton of power. And as soon as I keyed the mic, it drained my battery completely. And luckily, I had a flashlight in between my legs, kind of getting ready for some problems, and turned that on. And basically, at that point, I'd fly the rest of the night, about 8.5 hours by flashlight. And let me tell you, that's a long night. And that is also the night that I learned that always, if you're going to fly at night, always carry 2 flashlights. I didn't have 2 flashlights that night. And when it came time to change batteries, that was pretty nerve wracking, because it was solid IFR. And when you turn the flashlight off, it was pitch black. Couldn't see anything, including the instruments. And as you know, if you can't see any of your instruments, you're going to spin in. So always carry 2 flashlights. But the sun finally came up, and I was somehow managed to find the airport. and no radios, no gear. Had to buzz the tower to wake the guys up. They still didn't use the light gun to bring me in because, as it turns out later, their light gun was busted. Had to pump the landing gear down, no flaps, bring it on in, and almost got thrown in jail for that one because they weren't too happy because they weren't able to hear from me all night. That was an interesting evening. Had a Navajo a couple of years ago. I was took off out of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, in the evening into brown IFR, big dust storm. A lot of dust there, and it was pretty much brown IFR. And on climb out, I had another RBL come on. It was a vacuum pump. Lost a vacuum pump. Not a big deal. I'm in a Navajo. 2 engines, 2 vacuum pumps. You got to love redundancy. That was awesome. Till about 20 minutes later, the second one failed. Awesome. There we go. No gyro. DG didn't work. Artificial horizon fell off to the side. So I had 3.5 hours that night of flying needle ball airspeed. And actually, I kind of enjoyed it, even though I hadn't practiced that since my instrument training 30 years prior. I was really kind of enjoying it, trying to, keep the aircraft under control, just using nothing but your airspeed indicator and your ball and your turn coordinator. I was enjoying it until I noticed my engine instruments, and I saw that my right engine oil temperature was right up almost to red line, and my right engine oil pressure was really low, almost to the red line. Shined my flashlight out at the right engine and saw that there was oil all over the engine, so I had to shut that down. So I lost that engine. I kind of felt like I was in a simulator that night. They just keep, let's see, lose a vacuum pump, lose another one. Okay, now fail his right engine. It was a long evening. But we run into those problems a lot because a lot of the planes we fly are used airplanes. Only about 20% are new. And a lot of these used airplanes, they're being sold, and sometimes they're being sold because the owners haven't flown them in a while, and sometimes it takes them a couple years to sell them. So a lot of times these planes have been sitting for a couple years. And as most of you know, there's nothing worse for an airplane but to have it sit and not fly for a couple years. And now, although all these planes we fly have always gotten an annual, sometimes these annuals aren't as thorough as they could be. And so we end up running into a lot of maintenance problems when we fly ferry these airplanes. Now, we do what we can. I give it as extensive an annual as I can. I'm not an AMP. I have taken and passed my writtens, but I never took the practical. But I've been working on airplanes for 30 years, and I've got a pretty good handle on them. But there's only so much you can do. I mean, we don't bore scope the planes or anything. We do take the oil filter off and cut it open to see if it's making metal. But after that, it's just fly out over the ocean and hope she keeps running. And lots of times we have lots and lots of problems. Then the other problem that you're going to run into a lot is the ferry tanks. You're adding a complicated fuel system to an already semi-complicated fuel system, and you're going to run into trouble every once in a while, like the Platus did last month. Brand new multi-million-dollar airplane sitting at the bottom of the ocean right now. I had a number of problems over the years with my ferry tanks. Most memorable one was I was ferrying an F-33 Bonanza from St. John's, Newfoundland to Paris. And typically that route we would go from St. John's down to the Azores and then up to Paris. But when I got to St. John's, I looked at the winds aloft, and that evening there was just a smoking tailwind straight across the Atlantic, right to Paris. And I did some calculations and realized that I could skip the Azores and go straight to Paris. And that would be great, because the main goal of a ferry pilot is to deliver the airplane as economically as possible. Safety, unfortunately, is always second. Saving money is first, because these things are always running on tight margins. So wherever you can save a dime, you can. And if I can shave a whole day off my trip and 1,000 miles, plus the fuel that it takes to go down to the Azores and the landing fee and the hotels, taxis, all that, I would save the company a ton of money if I could go straight to Paris. The fact that I would get an extra day of hanging out in Paris had nothing to do with my decision. I swear to God, or very little anyway. But I decided that night to go straight across to Paris. which wasn't a big deal. You know, the F-33, we had ferry tanks in there, and we had plenty of gas, or I had plenty of gas. It's 2,500 miles, but you know, I would still have probably about a 2-hour reserve, which is pretty good. So I took off. I had to fly at 15,000 feet that night because that's where the winds aloft were the strongest, what I needed to stay in. And no, I didn't have any oxygen, but that was 25 years ago, and you can't violate me now anyway. So what are you gonna do? I had a pretty good high altitude oxygen tolerance back then, so I did that a lot. I usually fly as high as I can when I'm ferry flying for a number of reasons. Airplane performs better up high. Your radio reception is higher, is better. And you have longer to deal with the problem if there's something. You know, but from 18,000 feet, you've got over a half an hour before you hit the ground, so you can maybe fix a problem. So about 4 hours into that trip, my wing tanks were down quite a bit, and I switched to my ferry tank. And and the way that ferry tank on that particular plane was plumbed is, though the fuel from the ferry tank went out to the wing tanks, and then from the wing tanks fed right into the engine. And the ferry tank was pressurized by a ram air tube that we normally would drill a hole in an access panel in the bottom of the plane and have a J tube bolted in place to keep it aligned with the slipstream, and that would go to a hose to the top of the ferry tank, and that's what would pressurize the ferry tank to force the fuel out to the wings. Now, on this particular Bonanza, I don't remember exactly why, but my boss and the mechanic didn't have an access cover that had a hole in it, and they didn't want to drill a hole in a brand new $400,000 airplane, so they stuck that J tube sideways out through the side of an access panel and duct taped it in place. Now, I wasn't too crazy about that setup, but they assured me it'd be great and told me to make sure it was good and secure every time I took off. And I had tested it twice before I took off over the ocean. You know, from St. Paul to Bangor, it worked fine. Bangor to St. John's, it worked fine. So I was pretty confident that it was going to work that night. When you hear the word confident, you can also substitute that for complacent. Always a problem. So that night I turned on the ferry tank, and after about 10 minutes, I realized that the fuel wasn't transferring. And that was a big problem because I had made a huge mistake that night. And my mistake was not testing that ferry system before I passed the point of no return. And I'd gotten complacent. I'd been ferrying for a number of years, and I just.
Okay. Do you want to hear this at all?
Maybe in a minute.
Okay. All right. I'm on the phone with me.
So Becky, you need to mute now.
Jerry, you still there?
Jerry, just mute everybody except your
Okay.
presenter.
All right. I didn't know if they lost me or something. All right.
Sorry.
No problem. Just making sure I'm not just talking to myself. All right. So anyway, so yeah, I was way past the point of no return, and I needed that gas in those ferry tanks. And so I shook the plane as much as I could, positive, negative G's, banged down the valve, turned it back and forth a bunch of times, but nothing was working. And at that point, I realized that was my Apollo 11 moment. I mean, I was as far from help as the astronauts were on the way to the moon. And actually, I was more alone because at least they had NASA and a team of engineers to help them figure stuff out. I had nobody but me. I mean, I could have called ATC, but all they're going to say is, bummer, because no one could help me. So I took the cap off the fuel tank, and yep, there was no air pressure coming out. I kind of figured it was something to do with my pressurization problem. And I always fly with tools with me, so I uncoupled the pressure line, and I looked at it, and I figured, how am I going to get pressure into that ferry tank? And I couldn't stick it out the window. I had a big plate mounted on there. That was what the HF radio mounted, so it was a metal plate over the window, and I didn't want to open the door. And I don't know if that was going to work anyway. So I thought to myself, I looked at things like, I wonder if I could blow in this tube. And so I tried it, just like blowing up an air mattress. I blew into that tube as much as I could until I got as much pressure and put my thumb over it. and it worked. Awesome, moved some fuel. And I did some calculations, which is kind of tough to do when you're super hypoxic, because you got to remember, I'm at 15,000 feet. Now I'm hyperventilating, really exerting myself into this hose. Plus the cabin's filled with 100 octane fumes because I'd opened up the ferry tank, so I was good and stoned. But I did some calculations, realized I'm pretty much going to have to blow in that tube continuously for 8.5 hours or so, all the way to Paris. So wonderful. So I got started, and that turned into definitely the longest night of my life. Just sitting there at 15,000 feet, just continuously blowing into that tube really, really drained me. And I hadn't slept the night before, and I've been flying since Maine, and it really took it out of me. One of my biggest concerns was falling asleep, because I was afraid that if I fell asleep and the wing tanks ran dry and the engine quit, that would probably wake me up. But I was really doubting my ability to blow into that tube fast enough and hard enough to pressurize the ferry tank quick enough to push that fuel out to the wing tanks to get to the, through to the engine, to get the engine started again before I hit the ocean. So I did my best to stay awake, and I was not successful. I think I passed out about 3 times that night, but I always woke myself up in time to keep the engine going. My one possible saving grace was maybe I could land in Ireland. My course was taking me just off the southern coast of Ireland, but I wasn't too optimistic because I'd seen the weather forecast and they were supposed to be pretty bad. And when I got close, I'd asked for the forecast for Southern Ireland, and they said all the airports there were closed, 0 visibility. I could have declared an emergency at that point, but in the state I was in, trying to fly as an approach down to 0 just would have been suicide. There's no way I would have made that. So I just kept going, just kept blowing in that hose. And a lot of people ask me why I didn't declare an emergency. I just didn't see the point. I mean, there's nothing they could do for me. I was headed direct. I'm out of the ocean. They weren't detouring me around. If when I got to Paris, if they would have given me a hold or something, then I would have said something. But it was early in the morning. They brought me right in. I did notice that when I started descending and got lower altitude, I started thinking more clearly and better, and I realized I should have descended earlier when I got over the coast, and I would have been thinking more clearly and probably would have made things a little easier. So yeah, interesting stuff happens when you're flying small airplanes around the world. And because of that, I got on a couple of years ago. I got hired to be on the Discovery Channel on a TV show called Dangerous Flights. It's where they followed me and a number of other ferry pilots around the world for a couple of years, showing what's really like to be a ferry pilot and fly around the world. Everything in that show is true, except if you watch it, there's one scene where it looks like I'm running out of gas over the Amazon. That's not true. Everything else is true, though. Although it also makes for a good book. After years of boring my friends and family with all these stories, they finally hectored me enough into writing a book. So I sat down, and 10 years later came up with the book called Ferry Pilot, which is I published this year on July. It's going really great. It's alternating number 1 and number 2 slot at Amazon in the aviation history and aviation books. So it's going really well. I'm really happy that came out. It was going well. Tell you, releasing a book to your friends and family and strangers is actually scarier than flying out over the ocean, because you don't know how good you are until you do it. And I was afraid people were going to tell me I wrote like a 3rd grader, but apparently it turned out okay, so everybody likes it. And that's pretty much it for my ferry flying stories. I still ferry fly. I don't do as much as I used to. I'm trying to kick the single engine over the Atlantic habit. It's super dangerous, and I really don't want to get killed. But I have this medical condition. It's called can't say no-itis, and people can talk me into just about anything. And it's really hard to quit, because ferry flying has afforded me some of the most unique opportunities in the world. I've got to do the coolest things that you can imagine. I got to buzz down the Amazon first thing in the morning twice, buzz over Africa, nice down lows, watching Africa's or elephants and zebras and giraffes. I got to buzz the pyramids in Egypt, right in between the pyramids 3 times, right over the Sphinx. I was flying with Anwar Sadat's son, and he told me he could keep me out of any trouble. So far, I haven't lost my license for that one, but I'm waiting to see what happens there. That was a long time ago. And got to meet cool guys like you. So that's my story. Fly small airplanes over the world, around the world, and haven't got killed yet. These days, I do my other safe job. I'm own a skydiving school in Minneapolis, and I do about 700 or 800 jumps a year, way safer than ferry flying. So one of these days, I'll hang up my ferry flying spurs, but not yet. So, if you guys got any questions, I'd be happy to bore you some more.
Okay, we'll open it up to questions. We'll let you guys take yourselves off mute. When you get finished asking the question, please go ahead and remute your microphone.
Yes, this is John Taylor. I have a question. Is your daughter still flying?
She doesn't fly very much anymore. She's really into skydiving now. And wind tunnel. She's a wind tunnel instructor in San Diego. I'm actually on a road trip right now on the way to see her. But my son has been flying a lot. My son Connor, he's 24 years old, and he's been flying, but he's also gotten the skydiving bug, and it's hard to keep those guys in the cockpit. They like to jump out.
Hi, this is Sergio. I have a question. When you get up to cruise at your altitude, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yeah, when you get up to cruise to your altitude, do you pretty much follow the POAs, or do you have your own sort of mixture of cruise settings to make sure that you have enough fuel where you're going?
Well, that I use the POH a lot. I like to run Lena Peak if I can. It's kind of interesting the altitude and power setting formula that I use, especially with ferry tanks, because when you're really heavy, I usually start off about 5,000-6,000 feet for a couple hours to burn off some fuel, and then I kind of step climb and allow myself to drift up higher. A lot of it depends on the winds aloft, and the plane I'm flying. I won't go super high if the winds aloft aren't really helpful up there. I know a lot of people think that real high altitude is always best, but that's not always the case. Sometimes 10,000 feet's a good sweet spot, but I like wide open throttle Lena Peak if I can do it.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
So Kerry, Yonel Charles has asked, what was the compensation like? The pay
Well,
like?
when I started, it was $1,000 for a trip to Europe and $1,500 to Africa or the Middle East. A Europe trip would take you about a week. It always took a week, basically, or longer. And Africa and Middle East, usually a week and a half or 2. So you weren't getting rich of it, but you can't replace the adventure. And it's a weird thing with the compensation in ferry flying. The smaller and more dangerous the plane is, the less the pay. You get a guy that's ferrying a G5 and he's making bang. And it's nothing. It's like, it's so easy. You get some poor schlub trying to get a 172 across there, and some of these guys are doing it almost for free, which is just madness, but it is what it is.
Was when you were ferrying on a regular basis, was it a pretty consistent job, or were there like lulls here and there?
It was consistent for a couple of years. I used to make about 15 to 20 trips a year for a couple of years, and then things started slowing down a bit for me. Ferrying was really, really busy in the 70s and 80s. early 90s when I started, you know, like I said, I started in 1990. I was kind of on the tail end of it when things were getting busy. After about 10 years, I kind of semi-retired because I was really into my skydiving career and getting that running. But, you know, so these days I maybe do 1 or 2 trips a year just to kind of keep the adventure alive, because God, I just love it. There's nothing like it.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a rush. Back then, how did you advertise?
Back then, you know, I don't know. Back then I worked for another company, and a lot of it was word of mouth and stickers on airports and stuff, because yeah, we didn't have the internet. You know, and Yellow Pages wouldn't do you really any much good. So I'm not sure how my boss did it, but there were a number of companies back in the 90s, Globe Aero, Southern Cross, Orient Air, that kind of had a reputation, you know, and that's kind of how you got it, you know. It's word of mouth.
Thank you.
Yep.
Are there a lot of pilots, ferry pilots in the space? Are you like a prehistoric beast that's pretty rare, or are there a bunch of guys doing it?
Oh, there's still guys doing it. Yep. Fair amount. It's not like, actually there wasn't a lot back then either. It's really hard to get into it now. Back when I started, the insurance companies they trusted the ferry pilot company owners more about who they gave. I mean, they would throw me into planes that I had not only never flown before, really kind of had no business in. I mean, they put me in a Beech 99 one time. I had almost no twin turbine time. I didn't even know what a Beech 99 was. And they say, here, fly this from Finland to Canada. And a Beech 99, it's a big 19 passenger turboprop commuter. Like, okay. I had no idea what I was doing. But these days, insurance companies are really picky, and they won't cover you unless you've flown the route before. And you can't fly the route unless you've got a job. I mean, so it's kind of a catch-22 becoming a ferry pilot these days. Some of the companies, they'll send you with another pilot on a couple of trips to get your experience, but there's just not enough work to go around to do that. So a lot of young kids want to be international ferry pilots, and it's just, they ask me all the time how to do it, and I go, kind of got to get lucky, get one of these companies to mentor you.
Let me ask you a question about the insurance. If the company is taking insurance out on the plane, is the company taking insurance out on you if something happened to you?
No, usually you've got to have your own insurance. They're only covering the plane. They don't care about the dumb pile of meat in the front seat.
Okay.
So Bill Skinner's asked, how many off-airport landings have you made over the years?
One. I've got 4 dead stick landings, but I managed to get to the airport in 3 of them. I was ferrying a Super Cub up from Florida to Minnesota 10, 15 years ago, and had carb ice problems and had to set that down. Which is, if you're ever going to land off, a Super Cub on Tundra tires is the plane to do it. It was like, no big deal. Just land. Oh, I suppose crashing the airplane on the side of the runway was that's kind of an off-airport landing.
Those count.
I wasn't flying though. I was in the back seat screaming, so technically that wasn't my fault.
And on average, how many times did you make a ferry flight in a year? Ballpark.
Back, like I said, back in the 90s, I would do 15 to 20 for a number of years, and that kind of petered off to 5, 10. Nowadays, it's probably 1, 2. I'm also flying corporate now too, so it's I've really kind of slowed down a bit.
Hey, Kerry, earlier you said while you were talking, you said you never really got lost before GPS, but did you ever come close, and what kind of feelings did you have?
I did question my position once quite strenuously. I was flying from Libreville, Gabon to Dodoma, Tanzania, which is literally all the way across Africa, right along the equator. My weather briefing, when I showed up in the morning, they handed me a mimeograph sheet of an infrared shot of the satellite of the continent of Africa and said, "Have a nice flight." That was my entire weather briefing to fly across the entire continent of Africa. No winds aloft, no forecast, no nothing. And I had a GPS along, but it was broken. And so that was about a 13-hour flight. And I knew there was about 8 hours in the middle that I wasn't going to have any nav aids. But when I got to the point where I should start picking up a VOR, it didn't come up. And that time came and went, and the sun went down, and I had to battle some thunderstorms. Then the point where a second VOR should come up, that time came and went, no VOR there. So at that point, I was really, really questioning where I was, because I hadn't had a nav aid in 9 hours. It was night over Africa in the clouds. And I was really worried about flying out over the Indian Ocean, because you can't see shoreline in Africa because there aren't any houses with lights like in the US. And I almost took a left and tried to find Nairobi, but I pressed on, trusted my compass, and got the NDB at the airport I was flying at and landed there. And when I was having dinner with the pilots that were the local pilots there, and I told them that story, they all looked at each other like, "Didn't you know? Those VORs never work. The local warlords always steal the gas for the generators." Like, little information I could have used about 10 hours prior to that. So that was about as lost as I ever got. But that was a scary night.
Wow. Yeah, I imagine.
So Darren Reddix asked, what precautions did you take when flying over or near war zones?
On that particular flight that I just mentioned, the first section I was flying over the Congo, and I'd met a couple of British pilots the night before at the bar, and I'd asked them about flying over the Congo because we'd been trying to get overflight permits for 2 months for that trip, and we couldn't get the government in the Congo to answer us. And I told these guys that, and they said, "Oh yeah, that's how it works." And because they were having some wars going on too, they say what happens is when you fly over the Congo and you check in with ATC, they're going to say you don't have permission, force you to land. Then they throw you in jail, hold you for ransom for your company until they pay whatever they can get out of the company. And then when they release you, they'll give you your plane back, but they'll have stolen all the radios, taken all your money. So what they suggested I do was turn my transponder off and fly treetop level of the Congo. So that's what I did. Dodging the trees. Didn't get shot.
So Dana Clark has asked, have you ever flown to China or Russia?
I haven't flown over China at all, but I've crossed Russia a couple times. I flew over Russia one time, and I flew a ferry to Phenom 100 from Australia to Vegas, and that one didn't have the legs to go from Hawaii to California, so went all the way up to Russia, across to Alaska. And then I also got super lucky and got hired to be part of a 6-plane formation of planes that flew around the world. They're epics. It's a home-built single-engine turbine, awesome plane, super fast, great performers. And we flew all the way across Russia, so that was really cool. Russia's awesome. The vodka's great. The women are grouchy, and the weather's terrifying.
So who was the nicest person you've ever met in your travels, and who was the meanest?
Nicest, probably, her name was Amel, and I don't know why I remember it. She was in the Caribbean. The airport greeter, she was just the sunniest, nicest lady. That was on the TV show. I was flying with my daughter in a Bonanza. We flew from Uruguay to South Carolina, and I gave my daughter the Christmas present of any island in the Caribbean that she wanted to land at and spend Christmas at. And when we landed, this woman was just above and beyond nice. And the meanest was probably the airport dispatch guy in Zurich. One of the problems we had back in the 90s was maps and approach plates. You know, back then we didn't have ForeFlight and iPads, so when you flew a plane around the world, you literally had a cardboard box full of maps and approach plates, and getting current plates and charts was virtually impossible. So whenever you got ready for a trip, you would go into the boss's office and dig through the stack of maps that guys had brought back and find the most current ones you could find, and that's what you'd go flying with. Now, luckily, they don't move the continents around very much, but they do change frequencies from time to time. And when I was in Zurich, I knew they were going to give me a SID, an instrument departure, leaving there. So I asked the guy if he maybe make a copy of the one that they were going to give me, and he was pretty. He was flabbergasted that I didn't have current charts for Zurich. I'm like, dude, it's 1992. Didn't even know I was going to be there. That's the thing when you're ferry flying, you've got a plan of how you're going to get to Singapore, but just like in battle, a plan never survives first contact with the enemy, and the enemy is Murphy's Law, weather, fuel problems, stuff like that. So sometimes you have to call an audible and go to countries that you weren't planning on going to.
Right. And Dana's asked again, and Dana, by the way, is the wife of a husband-wife team. They each own a Swift. They have his and her Swifts.
Oh, cool.
So, yeah, she's asked, what would make you decline a flight? What is too risky?
Well, I actually declined my very first flight about a month ago. Guy wanted me to ferry a yak from Germany to the US, and I just didn't want to. It has really short legs, and I didn't know how the heck we'd get a ferry system in that thing. And again, it's that whole single engine stuff. But I tell you, the plane I really should have said no to was a 310 I ferried from Egypt to Minnesota. The plane had a cool history. It was a gift from the Shah of Iran to Anwar Sadat. And when we picked it up, the new owner, he was very excited about the plane because it only had 500 hours on it. But that's in 30 years. And we tried to explain to him, that's not good. That's bad. The plane had sat for a long time. And it took us a week and a half to get it ready to go. And every night, my boss happened to be with me on that trip. And every night we go back to the hotel and say, we should go home. This is a plane we should not fly. But we flew it, and it fell apart around our ears the whole way back to the US. And one of the engines was using a ton of oil. The mode C didn't work the entire time. Try flying through Europe, bluffing your way through without a working mode C. That was fun. Cracks in all kinds of parts. The one left spinner started spewing dye, which indicates that the spinner's got a crack in it the last 2 days. I mean, that was one where we should have said no. It's a great write-up in my book. You should read that story. That's a pretty good one.
Okay. And so we've got about 8:05, and I know that you're on a trip. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up here, Kerry. We sure do appreciate your taking time out to speak to us in our chapter. We've got 30 individuals that joined for us, and I think they had some really good questions. You had some really good stories. I want to encourage everyone to go out and take a look at your book. It's called Ferry Pilot, 9 Lives Over the North Atlantic, and it's available on sale at Amazon for $15 paperback, or you can get it in Kindle as well. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah, and if anybody wants a signed copy, you can email me at kerrymccauley.com, and I'll sign one and send it out to you. So it's.
Hey, I just want to say your book is actually getting a lot of playtime, getting some good comments up on the 182 Skyline Facebook group. I was like, somebody mentioned it before this meeting. I was like, hey, I want to talk to that guy.
Cool. Yeah, it's going really great, and everyone seemed to really enjoy it. So I'm pretty happy. I'm already working on the sequel. I got lots of
man.
Lots of stories. Yeah. Okay.
Before you go, when you go back on TV, give a plug for EAA 34.
I will.
Yeah, we've got a website and a Facebook page and an Instagram page, and we don't know what to do with Instagram yet, but we've got an account.
Yeah, I've been experimenting with Instagram. It's a Ferry Pilot book or something like that. And I got some great pictures in there. I'm an old guy. This old new technology is kind of beyond me, so I'm doing the best I can.
Oh, completely understood. All right. Thanks, Kerry. We'll go ahead and end it here. Appreciate
All right.
everyone joining us. Have a good
Thanks.
night.
Have a nice
Bye.
evening.